Today we're going to look at the quilting technique known as Quilt-As You-Go. And that's when you deal with much smaller pieces of your project in your machine. It can be really daunting if you have the whole finished quilt and you're trying to manoeuvre that through your machine because it gets really heavy when you've added your wadding and your backing. What we're going to do now is talk about Quilt-As-You-Go, the technique. Now, Quilt-As-You-Go, the advantages are that you're dealing with smaller pieces of fabric or pieces of wadding and backing fabric through your sewing machine so you can handle it on a domestic machine much easier. It doesn't necessarily have to just be a square. You can break up your quilt in whatever chunk you want, but it's much easier to handle. Now, the technique I'm going to show you isn't the only technique that's out there, but it's the one that I quite like doing and I just find it very easy. So first of all, you're going to layer up your project. You have your backing fabric and your wadding, and it's particularly important that the backing fabric and wadding is at least 1.5 inches to 2 inches all the way around, and that will be explained a little bit later. When it comes to quilting, you're going to quilt it as normal, but you must not quilt past when you quilt it, you're going to quilt it as normal, but you must not quilt past 1/2 inch from the edge of this block in this case, and that is really important. So what I find easier to do is to mark that 1/2 inch mark. And I'm just using a Hera marker, which is like a seam creaser, because I don't always want to put a drawn line. You can use a marking pencil, it's entirely up to you. So I'm just marking that 1/2 inch so I know when I come to quilt that I don't want to go past that 1/2 inch. And that will become clear as to why I'm doing this a little bit later on. Just take your time and mark it all on all sides. I find if I don't mark it, I get carried away sometimes with my quilting, and then what you'll have to do is you will have to unpick. So you can see I've got that 1/2 inch increment from the edge of the project. I'm now going to go and quilt this block. Okay, so I'm just coming to the end of the quilting that I want to do on here. And I'm not using the automatic thread cutter because what I'll do ultimately is I will sew in my threads. So I've simply quilted around the applique hearts. Now, the thing to take into account if you're going to do Quilt-As-You-Go, you need to make that decision before you start constructing your quilt. And the reason for that is you need to decide how you want to chunk your quilt up in order to get it through your machine. This one is quite simple because it is just a lot of 12-inch blocks, and this is probably one of the easiest and most recognisable format for Quilt-As-You-Go. But there would have been nothing wrong with me actually sewing a couple of blocks together and then treating them as the one piece. So it's entirely up to how much you think you can handle in your machine. So the next job that we're going to do, we've quilted this, is we need to start and think about how we're going to join these 3 things together. The first thing you need to do is you need to pin back your wadding and your backing from the side that we're going to join. So I literally just fold it back beyond the patchwork block, and I'm going to get some nice long quilting pins and pin it out of the way. So it's just going through that quilting, the wadding, and the backing. And this is the Vlieseline 279 wadding, but regardless of what wadding you're using, this is what you're going to do. So now all I have exposed is this part. And I've already prepared one here earlier. So now I'm going to join the 2 blocks together as you normally would in a patchwork. And so it'll just take me a couple of minutes to pin this into place, and then using my standard stitch length and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to join these 2 together. So I'll just pin it, make sure I'm happy. So I've finished my pinning. Now, if you'd wanted to add sashing in between blocks, then again, as I said earlier on, just add your sashing at this stage and incorporate it. You don't need to be putting separate pieces of wadding, separate pieces of sashing and separate pieces of backing fabric in. That just gives you even more jobs to do. So I've pinned this. I'm going to take it to the sewing machine. I'm really concentrating on the fact that my backing and my wadding is out of the way, and I'm going to stitch this in place, and I'll then show you the next stage. So what we've done here is we've joined the two patchwork blocks together, and as I say, that could have had sashing in between if you desired. We're then going to unpin just the wadding, but keep the backing pinned back. So unpin the wadding, and we're now dealing with no backing there. So as you can see here, you couldn't possibly leave the wadding like this because you've got too much. So we need to trim the wadding down so it butts up together. So the easiest way I find of doing that is getting a pair of scissors and overcut rather than undercut initially. And what we want are the two pieces of wadding, can you see, lying flat together. Now, Vlieseline have a product called G785, and what you can do is cut yourself a strip of the G785 and just fuse it into place, and that will hold the wadding together. Alternatively, you can hand ladder stitch, or you could take it to the machine and you can zigzag it together. Zigzagging's a little bit more difficult, so I would personally either hand ladder stitch and use the G785. Now, if you're using the G785 on a small project, you could use that on its own and don't ladder stitch. However, if it's a large quilt, then I would highly recommend that what you did was use the G785 and then stitched as well. So once you've secured your wadding together, so the front blocks are together, the wadding's together, we're now going to unpick the backing. And at this point, you can do a couple of things. You can decide which of these two fabrics we're going to have overlapping. You could add a bias binding in at this point if you wanted to. So you just decide, I think I'm going to have the blue. No, I'm not, I'm going to have the cream, because I've decided to change my mind. So if the cream is going to be the one that's going to come over and fold under, then we're going to trim this one so it's going to nestle underneath the other one. So all you need to do is to pop it in line, and you can grab your iron at this point. And because if you're using the Vlieseline 279 cotton wadding, or if you're using the 276 natural cotton wadding, you can iron on top with no issues at all. So we're just going to iron that crease in there. And the reason for ironing it and just checking is because you don't want to trim the fabric off and make it too short. You're better off always overcutting at this point than undercutting. So I've ironed that. I'm now going to take a nice sharp pair of scissors, and I'm going to cut, I'm going to stand up to do this, cut this particular fabric here. I'd rather not use a rotary cutter at this stage. I just find the scissors just give you that little bit more control. So that's taken off there. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this side in half and give it a press. And I'm actually going to use my iron-on cloth just to protect everything. So I'm just going to give that a quick press there. And the iron-on cloth allows me to see exactly where I'm pressing. Turn that iron down a little bit. The joy of the iron-on cloth is if your iron overheated, you're not going to scorch your project. And at this point, it's the last thing that you would want to do is to have a lovely scorch mark when you're nearing completion. Just pop that onto there like that, and then we'll just give it a nice press. So now we're going to pop this over here, and it's entirely up to you to decide how deep you want this wrap over. If you wanted it less, then you could actually fold it over less, or if you wanted it deep, you can fold it deep, and then you're going to hand stitch a slip stitch or a whip stitch all the way up there to secure it. And then we've actually managed to piece these two pieces together. They're all quilted, they've been quilted on the domestic machine, and I'm just going to carry on. With this particular project, I'll do all the rows together, and then once I've done the rows, I will join them in exactly the same way by joining one row onto another. So Quilt As You Go isn't necessarily the quickest way of quilting a project, because whilst you will race ahead with the quilting of the individual elements of your quilt, you do have a little bit more work to do in the finishing off. However, the benefits are that it will allow you to quilt your project on a domestic machine, and you don't have to have the cost of a long arm quilting machine.
As you can see, Vlieseline has a wide range of products, each with different properties and benefits for your projects. You can view the whole range on the Vlieseline website, where you can download the brochure, which has detailed information on all of the products across our 4 categories. You can also join the conversation with us on our Facebook page, Creative Community Group and Instagram. All of the details are below.